Hey everyone, Gabe here from HomeStudioEngineer.com and ToastedBananas.com. And in this video, we're going to build on the last video we did, which was about the fundamentals of EQ and some EQ tips and tricks that can be applied to pretty much any mix. But in this episode, we're going to talk about two things. The first thing we're going to talk about is the secret to a great low end in your mix using EQ. And the second is how to deal with mid-range frequencies. Both of these topics are a bit challenging. In a lot of cases, it's hard for us as home studio engineers to balance our low end correctly because, our rooms lie to us about how much low end information that we're actually hearing that's actually in the mix. And a lot of times we just end up with, kind of muddy, undefined, a lack of clarity in the low end, things like that. Similarly, the mid-range is another challenging area because, pretty much every track has some amount of sonic information that occupies the mid-range. And there are certain instruments, obviously, that primarily occupy the mid-range. So what happens is we tend to, find the areas that sound good on the EQ for those instruments and we boost them. But what happens is we end up with a buildup of too many of those frequencies. So we're going to talk about how to use EQ to get clarity in the mid-range as well. But before we get started, I want to give you a free gift. There is a link in the description where you can download the Simple Guide to EQ, which is a free PDF guide that talks about everything from the fundamentals of EQ all the way through to talking about what we're going to talk about in this video and a ton of tips and tricks in between. So definitely make sure to download that and keep it as a reference guide. So now let's talk about high and low pass filters. And high and low pass filters are, in my opinion, the secret to getting a great mix. They're some of the best features of EQ, and using them is really, really simple. Now, the logic of using high and low pass filters goes like this. Use a high pass filter, which means we're rolling off the low end frequencies, on tracks where you don't need as much of the low end. So think typically vocals, guitars, hi-hats, stuff like that. Use a low pass filter, meaning we're rolling off the high end frequencies, on tracks where you don't need as much of the high end or mid range. So think kick drums, bass guitar, low end synths, things like that. So let's just use guitar as an example. We don't need as much low end on a guitar typically, unless we're working like really heavy metal, then we probably want some of that. But typically we don't need as much low end on the guitar because we want the bass to carry most of that and we want room for the kick drum down there. So we're going to use a high pass filter. Now, the key to using high and low pass filters is determining where you want to start rolling off the frequencies. It's easy to determine which filter you need. Obviously, on a kick drum, you're going to use a low pass filter. Obviously, on these guitars, you're going to use a high pass filter. But figuring out where to start rolling off those frequencies is key. So obviously, we don't want to do something like this on a guitar. Use the high pass filter, start rolling off everything below 1K. That's going to sound terrible. So what we do is we use the same logic that we use when figuring out which frequencies to boost or cut. We play the track and we just move this along until it feels right. And you can apply that to any track. Same thing with the low pass filter. So say you're working on a kick drum, you can figure out where feels right. Another thing is that most EQs are going to let you adjust how severe this filter is. So right now it's fairly gentle, but we can actually move this up and make it more severe. So this is going to be more aggressive filtering, whereas this is a lot more subtle. This is going to let a lot more of the highs through than this is. But while we're on the topic of using these filters, talking about the secret to an awesome low end in your mixes. And the secret to an awesome low end in your mixes is to use high pass filters. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive based on what I just told you. I told you we should use low pass filters on kick drums and stuff like that. But hear me out. When we want, a big, beefy low end, we tend to boost. We tend to boost 60 hertz on our kick drum and 80 on our bass. And sometimes we'll get super aggressive with those boosts. We'll boost 7, 8 dB. But what people don't understand about these low end frequencies is that the amplitude of these waves is much, much longer than the waves towards the high end frequencies. So what happens is when we boost too many of these low end frequencies is that they actually start to cancel each other out. And the result is actually less low end, even though we're boosting. and what little bit of low end we do have becomes really muddy and undefined. So we can use high pass filters to take care of this problem. So let's just use a kick drum as an example. We'll put the low pass filter on. We'll say we did something like this for a low pass filter. We'll come down here, say we boosted somewhere around 60 hertz. Made a little boost there. So generally speaking, and again, there are always exceptions and every track is unique, but generally speaking, we don't get a whole lot of benefit from this super low stuff down here. You know, really below 30, sometimes 40, we're not getting a whole lot of benefit. A lot of times that stuff's not super audible, but it builds up over time at each track, and that causes the low end to become muddy. So what we can do is we can put a high pass filter in, back it up here, and we can have this start. We can actually type it in manually. We can have this start at 30 hertz. We can start rolling that stuff off because we don't need it. We're getting a nice boost at 60, so that's going to give us a nice solid low end, and all this stuff here is going to be good for us. We're rolling off the stuff we don't need. We don't need this stuff down here either. Now, if you go and you do this on your kick drum, you probably won't hear very much difference. But the key to using high-pass filters to shape the low end is to roll off the stuff you don't need on every track. So, you know, your vocal, your guitars, your bass, roll off all that stuff you don't need, because even though it doesn't sound like it makes a huge difference on one track, when you have, you know, all this information below 30 hertz on every single track, that builds up in your session, and before you know it, you know, you've got so much of that information down there that you don't hear in isolation, but you sure do hear it in the context of the mix. So rolling that stuff off will clean up your low end. It'll give more room for your kick and your bass to exist and to breathe, and you'll actually feel like you have a more solid low end, even though you technically have less low end frequencies. So try that out. Remember, it's a cumulative thing. It's something that you want to apply to all of the tracks. Roll off the stuff you don't need so that you can experience the cumulative effect. The second thing that we should talk about is dealing with mid-range tracks, and that's one of the most challenging aspects of EQ, is dealing with the mid-range, because the mid-range is where most sonic information is. Pretty much every track that you work with has some part of its sound in the mid-range. A lot of the tracks have most of their sound in the mid-range, you know, guitars, vocals, things like that. So the problem that you run into is a lack of clarity in the mid-range. When you've got, you know, 10 tracks or more that all occupy this space here, that stuff starts to build up and you start to lose clarity in the process. So when you're dealing with mid-range tracks, think about this. We'll use electric guitars as an example because it's a good example. You know, in a lot of cases, electric guitars are playing the same thing and they've got similar tones. So picture, you know, a hard panned left and right electric guitar situation. So let's say, for instance, that we know this boost of 1K sounds excellent on our electric guitar. So we could EQ both guitars exactly like the other. We could boost 1K, we could cut whatever. We could do the exact same thing. But what might be better is to try this. So we know we like 1K on the guitar, for instance. But what we should do is sweep around the area of 1K. See, like 1.5K, 2K, what's that sound like? What's it sound like just below 1K? And if that sounds good too, which it probably does, what we can do is we'll boost 1K on this guitar, and we'll go over to this other guitar, pull up an EQ, and we'll actually boost right below 1K. Maybe narrow that up a little bit. Boost right below 1K. So we want to boost similar but different frequencies so that we're not getting this huge buildup of 1K or whatever frequency. Another step that you can take is to cut a little bit of the frequency that you boosted on the other track from its corresponding track. So we could cut a little bit of 1K on this track. Doesn't have to be super aggressive, doesn't have to be too much of a reduction, but that will leave a little bit more room for the 1K on the other guitar to shine through. And we could go back over here and we could cut the frequency that we boosted on that guitar. So just experiment. That's one way to get clarity in the mid-range when you've got a lot of tracks competing for the same space. Find areas that sound good and boost the different areas on each individual track. So that's it. That's how to use EQ to get a better sounding low end and to deal with mid-range tracks. I hope you found it helpful. These past couple of videos have just been about kind of just using EQ in different ways and in ways that we might not think about. So I hope that you found them useful, and we'll do more videos on EQ and get into the specifics of EQing certain tracks in the future. But if you haven't already, be sure to download that free guide in the description, The Simple Guide to EQ. If you have any questions about anything that we covered in this video, please leave them below. There are other links that you can check out in the description, links to my social media, all sorts of stuff down there, so be sure to check that out. Please like and subscribe. But with that, thank you all so much for watching, and take care.